I was going to ask you a question. Of course, the negotiating position of the U.S. is very much predicated on what they're willing to do domestically will set the standards or the boundaries of what they're willing to do internationally. And there's a lot of work being done legislatively in the U.S. The House passed a climate bill that includes cap and trade. Do you have any predictions about what type of impact that will have in U.S. behavior? And do you think that such a bill can survive the gauntlet of the Senate?
Yeah, I do think it can survive the gauntlet of the Senate. I think it's probably easier to get a cap and trade deal through the Senate than it is through the House. And so the prospects are excellent that there will be new cap and trade legislation. But there's a couple of things to note in this connection. Cap and trade may or may not be the ideal solution. From the American political point of view, it's the only palatable solution. The other leading idea is typically called a carbon tax, and anything with the word tax in it is very difficult to sell to the American public and the American Congress. Indeed, the opponents of cap and trade like to call it sometimes cap, trade, and tax, which is not strictly speaking accurate, but it's a way of demonizing carbon control legislation. The other point to bear in mind is that enforcement of the law is a fairly complicated business, and it remains to be seen how energetic the federal government will be in actually trying to impose these rules that I think will ultimately be turned into legislation. I think a mixed record on cap and trade. In terms of sulfur emissions, it's worked pretty well. But I think that's easier to monitor because there's only a few sources of sulfur emissions. Carbon emissions come from a greater variety of sources, so regulation and enforcement will be a larger technical and political problem.
That's Professor John McNeill, environmental historian from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It's an interview that I conducted in August of 2009 down in Copenhagen, the place to be these days, it seems. That was the location of an environmental historian conference, the first World Congress of Environmental History, and all the big names in that branch were there. John McNeill, Donald Worcester, who's kind of one of the grand old men of the field, did an interview with him as well, actually, that we'll hear at some point on Think Globally Radio. Sverker Sorlin, perhaps the most well-known environmental historian in Scandinavia, he was down there as well. So learned a lot from that conference, and definitely a field that actually interests me quite a bit. Eric Paglia here in the studio tonight on Think Globally Radio. I'm kind of flying solo tonight, along with the interview which I did, like I said, a few months ago with John McNeill. Dave Truba, Josh Paglia, Lisa Runstein, and Rich Bloom, all unavailable tonight, but still interesting stuff to bring up. Talk maybe a little bit about some of the stuff happening this past week or so, and I can also point to next Sunday's show, which I think is going to be very interesting. We're having Andrew Mitchell, the British ambassador to Sweden. He's coming back for the third time on the show. Very good time to bring him in because he's a guy that is highly interested in the international negotiations around dealing with climate change, and I'm sure he's going to bring us a lot of insights into what's going on, perhaps even a little bit behind the scenes as well, in terms of the position of the United Kingdom, which has been a very active participant in these talks, as well as the European Union, of course, and just multilateral negotiations in general. So that's next Sunday on Think Globally Radio with Andrew Mitchell, British ambassador to Sweden, will be here in the studio. Tonight it's John McNeill, a recorded interview from a couple months ago. Get back to that in a moment, but first I thought I'd play a song, not an interview, but a song. I wish I did an interview with this guy. I tried to get in touch with Moby when he was in town. You might have saw this on MTV when he did this concert to raise awareness about climate change for the youth of today. He did that show over at Revolve. I was there for that. It was a good show, and Moby, definitely a very thoughtful guy who has very strong opinions about climate change and what needs to be done to tackle that. but I didn't get a chance to interview him. So instead, what I'll do is I'll just play one of his songs. This is his latest single called One Time We Lived. Moby, here on Think Globally Radio. We'll be right back.